Well, thanks everyone for coming, and both online and here in the classroom. My name is Anna Mance. I'm a professor at the law school. I'm one of the fall CTE faculty affiliates, and I think the title of this session is actually effective cold calling, but I just have cold calling up on the screen because I think
brevity is good.
Yeah. And we can debate, I think a lot of the research I've looked at does speak to the effectiveness of cold calling, but we'll discuss. So I always like to find out what disciplines people are in who are in the room, because I think that guides. Last time we had somebody who was a ballet dancer and a mathematician. So there's a wide variety of people on this campus, and I want to acknowledge that. So if you could just mention your names and your departments.
Jennifer Cottingham, I'm over in the Civil and Environmental Engineering.
Okay.
Ava Oberderster, Biology.
Okay.
I'm Libby Russ in World Languages and Literatures.
Okay, awesome.
Peter Moore, Mathematics.
Okay, so a wide range.
Eric Schmidt is
musicology. Okay. I recognize my colleague Tom Mayo, who's also in the law school. And economics. Okay, great. And Spanish. Okay, wonderful.
Constantly on the Spanish.
Okay, well, Spanish, that's actually, very. I think that's good. We have somebody from a language in the room. So I guess as a way to get started, I wanted to ask you all what you do right now in terms of cold calling or engaging students. So I forgot your name, but
Ava. No, that's
Ava.
fine.
Okay.
I teach pre-meds, and usually when I cold call, it's like blank stares. And so what I do instead is either make it into a game, a little bit of a game, like, give me the first one, give me the second one. Or I just have them do like little groups for 30 seconds and then have the group tell me what they discuss. So it's not like on one person.
Okay.
None of that is effective. It's just yelling it out. It's like Bueller and it's just terrible.
Okay. Peter, what do you do?
So I probably do something very similar to Ava at this point. I do know a good number of the students' names, but I generally will have them work in groups before I would do any cold calling. So I generally probably don't do very much of it.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
it doesn't get much of a response when I do it.
Even the cold calling or working in groups and then
No, the working in groups
Is better.
fairly effective. It helps.
yes, but the
definitely.
actual cold calling doesn't get a response. Okay.
Well,
Or not an accurate response.
Right.
Okay.
And then the other thing that I have is I have 2 students with DOS accommodations that I'm not allowed to call on them.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
It's exciting.
how do you not exclude them or include them in
That's when I do
in a-
general cold calling, and I don't, like, back in the day, or there was a lot of snowflakiness. That's not the right term, but you guys know what I mean. Like, they've gotten a little bit more delicate over the years. So like 15 years ago, I would just have a roster and I just literally have it on the overhead and just run my finger, and wherever it stopped, that's who got to answer it.
Okay.
And that I'm no longer watching that. So.
Okay. Can I ask you, remind me your name also?
Libby.
Libby, okay.
So I mean, I would say I was telling Peter as we were walking in, like I've seen colleagues, because I'm chair of the department, I get to observe my colleagues a lot, and I've seen a lot of colleagues who are very effective at cold calling. We have small classes, we know everybody's name.
Yeah.
I have a colleague who just keeps a deck of cards and she like goes
Yeah.
through, and whoever's name is there gets called on. I know that it can be very effective. I have a hard time doing it. For me, it feels like more like a psychological block. I would have hated it so much as an undergrad. It feels like, how do I do this without it being like torturous for some students?
Right.
So yeah, I tend to rely more on small groups and hoping that, that will, and having them do outside of class assignments so that they come in with questions that they've written and comments that they've written that they can share. But I still have, and it seems like a growing number of students who just resist unless I cold call them, unless I kind of force them into the conversation, they're just gonna stay silent and get a 0 for participation, even though it's 15% of their grade.
Okay. And again, remind me of your
I'm Jennifer.
Jennifer, okay.
I'm over in civil and environmental engineering, but I teach the engineers how to communicate, so. A lot of cold calling because I want them to pay attention and be ready to respond. So I don't know if I do it right. It's usually out of annoyance when they're not paying attention. If you know, the first of the semester, I'm clueless about who anybody is. So as the semester goes on, I know who they are, so I can call on them, but I don't know if sometimes it's more effective than others, and I think it just depends on the student.
Yeah, the dynamics of the classroom can be different group to group. Okay,
How many students do you have, Jennifer? 24.
okay. And you all have generally smaller
40.
classes?
40
40?
to 50.
30-ish.
No.
20.
Okay, yeah, so no big lecture
No.
classes, okay.
Constantine said that he uses the technique called Calle el Rayo, the lightning strike. Sounds scary, but it's not, and it worked really well. He tells the students he'll be cold calling them and then ask a question. He will wait 20 to 30 seconds, time which the students are told to answer the question in their head. And then he takes the student from the class. He's mindful of the student's personalities to avoid known challenges.
Okay, great. All right, so we'll come back to all of the techniques that you've just described, and I thought I would first, I teach in the law school, I teach first year law students, so that means one big lecture hall of, I had 85 students last year and I have 65 this year approximately. And in law school, you've probably all seen the movies, but part of the fear of 1Ls and law school is generally this idea that cold calling is part of the training. And so I think a lot of us, especially in the legal department, have been discussing, some people cold call, other people don't. So that's the perspective that I'm sort of coming from. I do cold call in my big lecture hall. But I'm also somebody who was terrified of being cold called when I was in law school. So,
And do you do a lot of like Socratic method type things still?
Yes.
Being in law school? Okay.
yes, yeah.
So I'm envisioning that being a lot more cold calling centered. I don't know. Yes.
It is, but not all teachers necessarily do it to the same degree or in the same way.
Right.
So, but the Socratic method is certainly part of like the
Law school.
law school training.
Yes.
But I think people have moved away from it in more recent years compared with the past.
Yeah.
Okay, in any case, so just so we're all on the same page, what is cold calling? Any instance, a couple variety of things depending on how you look at it, but any instance in which you're calling on a student whose hand isn't raised or who's involunteering, or just calling on a student without any previous warning. So sort of as I did there, I'm just going to call on you and ask you a question, and that is a form of cold calling. So why do we cold call? And I'm going to come back to a lot of the second bullet point. I'll repeat that in a later slide, but some of the motivations for cold calling are that it incentivizes preparation. If people know that they might be cold called, they have the fear of God in them, that they want to be prepared. They don't want to look silly. So they are more likely to prepare for class. So they will be more, they'll have read the material that you want them to be reading. The second kind of like main motivation for cold calling is that it improves class discussion and class participation. There's a ton of research on whether or not cold calling is effective or not and different ways to do it. A lot of the research comes out on the end of cold calling is effective and should be used. So again, it gives students opportunities to develop communication skills. It helps them to formulate arguments. It helps them to become more comfortable with being put on the spot, as they will be put on the spot at some point out in their professional lives. It does elicit higher reflective thinking because they'll have thought about it the day before and then have to come into class and sort of verbalize their, maybe not just the material, but their thoughts on the material. That helps, again, develop critical understanding and self-awareness. I think an important aspect of this is the appreciation for diverse perspectives. And then finally, students are generally better able to retain information. and if they're encouraged to learn and read at multiple different times, and cold calling is sort of the tool that helps them do that. Cold calling, again, forces participation in the conversation, and that just, you know, it's a forcing mechanism to bring you into the room. And then again, the diversity of viewpoints, if only some people express their opinions or only some people participate, you are necessarily only getting a small slice of the viewpoints that are in the room. So cold calling is a way to be more comprehensive in terms of what people actually think. And I think we can discuss this, but if there is a dominant ideology in a given class, most students are liberal, let's say, and there are only a few conservative students, to use that example. You don't want to eliminate the conservative viewpoints or make the students with viewpoints that are maybe out of the norm with the rest of the students feel that their views aren't valid or welcomed in the classroom. So cold calling is a way to sort of like neutrally include all of those different views in the classroom. Again, you raised a bunch of the concerns related to cold calling. It's that maybe this is based on your own experience or just how you perceive the students might feel. They'll feel uncomfortable, they'll be put on the spot, they might be humiliated if they haven't done the reading and then you ask them to speak. I think a main driving force behind participation is that you don't want to look silly in front of your peers. You want to be prepared. You want them to respect you. And so any situation in which you might potentially endanger the facade that a student has about their preparation is potentially concerning. Also, the heavy emphasis on participation as part of the grade might make students feel uncomfortable because, again, if they have viewpoints that are not maybe within the norm and they know that participation is a big part of their grade, but they don't feel comfortable sharing, that can maybe indirectly make them feel like they're not going to get a good grade just because of who they are, what they think. Again, it might seem like a punitive measure if you aren't participating voluntarily. I have been in classrooms where I see students who are sort of goofing off or not paying attention, and sometimes I do intentionally cold call on them as a way to bring them back in. That is sort of a punitive measure, and I don't think we want to rely on that measure, but it's a way of sort of like bringing people back together. But if you're only calling on students who never participate, and then the students who regularly participate are the volunteers, cold calling can seem punitive because it only is impacting the students who rarely engage. And then again, students' prior experiences, which none of us will probably know, whether or not they even like the class, maybe they have to take the class, they haven't elected into it, and they've got 20 other things going on and they're not interested, it's not their priority. All of that is going to affect their comfort level with participation. So I think it's just worth mentioning that like students are there maybe for different reasons, and that's going to impact their degree of participation. Again, cold calling can help force them to participate more in the class. They are there, you are going to give them a grade. But again, people are coming to the room with a different set of expectations and goals. Okay, so should we even bother with cold calling? Does cold calling work? I did a pretty extensive survey of some of the research that's out there. This is not my area, so I just wanted to see, what education scholars are saying about cold calling. And most of them report that students both like cold calling and that it increases participation and effectiveness in the discussion. I realize this is blocking some of the text here. Where there are classes with higher levels of cold calling, students engage more, they participate more voluntarily, and they participate more frequently. And then down here, again, where you prepare them for, this is going to be a class in which we have a lot of cold calling. Again, students become more accustomed to the concept of participation, and they engage more voluntarily. That engagement increases over time. So in the beginning of the semester, they're sort of nervous, but then they see like, yes, this is just a class in which we all participate. That increases over time. Their comfort levels, actually most students report preferring cold calling because it makes them, again, you develop a comfort with the participation. Relative to classes with low cold calling. So students, I think, actually like the environment in which there's more participation, even if it's by virtue of cold calling relative to low cold calling. And then finally, higher levels of cold calling does help develop communication skills. The more the student practices and engages in class participation, the more comfortable they become, the more they build their confidence, the more they want to participate. So there's sort of a virtuous cycle that develops out of cold calling.
So I have a question. I mean, most of this is pre-COVID.
Yes,
And
yeah.
it's maybe too early, but I think some of the concerns people have is that
Yeah.
COVID has changed the nature of what students are bringing to the classroom.
Absolutely.
Not that
Yeah.
some of these wouldn't still be valuable,
Yeah,
but cold calling may look very different post-COVID than it did pre-COVID based on what they're coming out of this school with or what they came out of high school.
1000% agree.
I don't know whether that's true or not, and I don't know what more recent studies, if any, have indicated, but that I think is a particular concern
Mhm.
that people have about doing this.
Yeah.
The students do seem a little more passive than they did before.
Yeah, they're very much used to just passively watching.
watching a screen rather than participating.
Yeah.
Do you find that your students, have they verbalized that they want, I actually got a student make an anonymous comment the other day that we have more effective conversations when you don't cold call. And I was like, well, I think that's just because like you're relying on the people who do participate a lot to pick up the
Right.
weight.
Mhm.
But I think it comes from, that comment was driven more by a fear of being put on the spot.
Yeah.
But do you all think that there's a marked difference between post-COVID and?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's night and day. It
interesting.
really, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that, because we do this one concept called the Starling forces. It's a big deal in medicine, and so for about a month, every day at the beginning, we're like, okay, what are the 4 Starling forces? What is their magnitude? So this is like the intro to every class for a month. Pre-COVID, the whole class would be like yelling and getting into it, and now it's like maybe 2 kids that are like 35. You know, it's really dramatic. What are your
Yeah.
experiences since you
Well,
brought
I
it
mean,
up?
if I was out in the classroom for 13 years in
Mm.
administration, so I don't really have any way of knowing exactly. But having talked to lots of faculty, this does seem to be a common thread I've heard in a good number of courses.
Mhm. Have you noticed with your engineers? I think they're.
Yeah, they're-
Do you have undergraduate engineers
They're
or
juniors
graduate?
and seniors.
Mhm.
So half of my class are computer science majors and they are pretty quiet.
Yeah,
They're
yeah.
like the introverts of the engineering school.
Yes, yeah,
That makes sense.
yeah.
It's really hard to say.
Some of them are not.
I've noticed this semester a change in that they're back into more candid responses. I have a very interactive class
Oh,
this
good.
semester, but last spring it was really frustrating. So I think it depends on the student mix.
Yeah.
And their personalities and their feeling of, I try to make them comfortable. So I do a lot of icebreakers, so
Yeah.
they feel comfortable
Mhm.
with each other and we get to form teams. So I think that helps a lot. And
Yeah,
then I learned something when I first started teaching from Addie about pausing. So if I just close my mouth and
Yes.
make them nervous, then they start talking.
Yes,
Opposite
the
way.
power of silence, yeah.
So I do that, and then I have some people who want to get good grades in the class and they know I grade on participation. So I have a few that,
Mhm.
you know, do the heavy lifting and
Yeah,
some that never say anything.
yeah,
We have Tanya from
yeah.
online, and some students just reply that they don't know the answer if they, you know, they're put on the spot.
I guess,
And
yeah.
she said that, you know, that's something that she doesn't remember having that responsible for COVID. And then Eric mentioned that engagement has really dropped for him, but also been teaching different institutions before, during, and after the peak of the pandemic, so it's hard to know if there could be like other factors.
Yeah.
I've been here 25 years.
Okay. So you've got
One institution.
a good art.
Post. And
Yeah.
It's been really shocking. And the students, like in lab or in smaller groups, share with me that they have kind of lost the ability to interact.
Yeah. Which might be a reason why you should do more cold calling.
Exactly. That's what I tell them. I'm like, I'm here to reverse that for you.
This is a big problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I
Yeah.
tell them. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just sort of as an aside to this conversation, I haven't done it yet, but I intend to do it next year, is to disallow computers in the classroom. And then I know people have their phones out, but I at this point am not afraid to kind of like stare at somebody who's looking at their phone for an uncomfortable amount of time. And then they realize that they're the ones, that I'm staring at. So, I feel like that's a question of respect more for yourself and for your classmates and for your instructor, more so than a question of like engagement or preparation. So and maybe it's important to like separate out what the issue is in that regard. But just in terms of, and I haven't looked at any more recent research. I didn't see anything that looked very relevant that was post-COVID, but I'm sure there's a lot of stuff that's in the works right now on cold calling and COVID.
Also, Tanya online commented that she tried not to call students that are not making eye contact with her. So that it's a given that they don't want to.
That they're uncomfortable, yeah. Let's see, go back to this. Well, just a few methods, and again, you all have echoed some of these things, and I apologize, the font is very small, so I'll read it out, but I think a really important aspect to cold calling is framing and setting expectations. Telling students that this is part of your grade, if that motivates them, letting them know that it's an expectation that they will participate, letting them know also that you can have a pass, and sometimes I limit it to like 2 passes or 1 pass, so they don't feel like they can every single time say, I just don't know the answer. If somebody says, I don't know, I will ask them a more softball question related to the issue, and I sort of stick with them, partly to help that student work their way through it, but also to signal to other students that I don't know isn't a response that you can get away with. So setting expectations and framing, and then modeling in the early days of class what you are willing to do or not do, I think really gives students clues about what they're going to have to show up for, how much they're going to have to prepare, and that kind of thing. Second, a lot of you have echoed or like mentioned this warming up cold calls. So kind of prefacing that you're going to cold call on them. So you can either do it in advance of class, email a few students and say, I'm going to call on you tomorrow in class. These are the questions I will ask you, so you can prepare and feel prepared in the moment. And I think this is especially effective for international students or ESL students. Again, also use pre-class discussions. I often use the discussion board on my Canvas page. I'll put up I want your reflection on this issue. You have to post something before class. And so at least they've thought about it. And I might look through and pick out a few and then like call on the students, particularly to say, you made this comment in the discussion thread. I want to follow up on that. So it's not a total surprise. Again, in class, and I got this from a colleague of mine, but I will say, I put half the class on notice that they'll be cold called on Tuesdays and the other class will be on Thursdays. So there's one day for sure in the mix of the 30 or 40 students in that day, they might be the one that gets called on. And then I'll sort of say like, okay, Joe or Mr. Smith or something, I'm going to call on you in a second. So he can perk up and recognize, all right, I'm about to be cold called, or I'm about to be called on. And then I sort of like lead up to the question I'm about to ask. And then I ask him to go ahead and answer. Again, posing the question to the whole class and letting them get in small groups to discuss, and then asking particular people, you know, or like you're a spokesperson for your group. So it makes them feel like it's a less personal response, but you're the mouthpiece for what your group discussed. Structured cold calls. This would be where you start the class in the same way every time, but a different student is called on to answer the question, or to start you off. So we know that in a seminar, one of you all is going to be asked to kick us off, but I'm not going to say who it is in advance. So everybody has to be prepared enough to be able to be that person. And again, this is testimony from one particular student that came out of the study, that because we didn't know in advance who would be called on, we all came very prepared. Framing the tenor of the question, start with an easy question, and then stick with the same student and lead up to a harder question in order to help build confidence. Something that's more straightforward and obvious is always like a nice way to make the student feel like I'm contributing something that's right. Or I'll ask their opinion and be sure to say, like, every opinion is valid. Everybody's going to have a different viewpoint. I want to know your specific opinion on this issue. That way, whatever they say is right, you know. And then I mentioned this earlier, but frequency and uniformity of cold calls to avoid the perception of this punitive cold calling. Make sure you're cold calling in a way that doesn't just focus on low frequency participants. I mentioned clickers here. This is like a part of an aspect of participation. It doesn't really go to cold calling because you're not asking somebody to articulate whatever their response was that they clicked on. But I don't know, we could talk about whether or not you think those are effective ways to increase participation. Because again, I think that this conversation about cold calling is really about increasing participation. I know that these are fun for polls, but I tend not to use them because I think I find technology in the classroom to be kind of distracting. And I just maybe haven't needed it personally. In other disciplines, it might be more helpful. Okay, that's all I have in terms of, I'll put this up as this is my final slide. But yeah, I think do these methods, and again, this might relate to the COVID, post-COVID conversation, but I found a lot of these to be really effective in increasing participation. And I know when instructors have used them when I'm in the class, I respond to that. In a class that I'm less likely to participate in, I prefer to be cold called on if I know that it's part of the grade and it makes me feel like it's an expectation. I have to do it. I think I'm unlikely to be willing to volunteer unless I know that somebody's going to call on me at some point. So I might as well volunteer early on a question I actually do know, or risk, having being called out later on. So for me, I found that cold calling actually, it's uncomfortable, but over time it does build confidence. And then you become more and more comfortable with your classmates too. And as you get to know them over the course of the semester, you sort of know each other. So you feel less of the fear of making, sounding silly in front of somebody if you get it wrong. But do any of these, this can just be a kickoff for a conversation about whether or not you think these are actually effective. I know you've done some of them, but you think still, nevertheless, the students sort of don't respond to the small group discussions or anything like that. And happy also, I can't see what's in the chat, but I'm relying on Patty to pull things off the chat.
Don't be the message.
it's just, as I mentioned, I have 2 DOS accommodations where it's like you're not allowed to cold call on them because it increases their anxiety too much.
Okay,
And so I don't know, have you all seen anything like that? It's the first time I've gotten one. I was like, I teach pre-med, so I'm like, you think this is anxiety induced? I was like,
Let's try the emergency.
yeah.
yeah,
You know, a patient screaming at you or vomiting on you or something like that, but I do know, I have noticed since COVID that our students have become very fragile emotionally and like shut down very quickly. Like they have no grit at all. They just, anything that's uncomfortable, they're just, they shut down.
yeah,
So that's why this semester I've really backed off from cold calling. Because when I do that, I have like the few that are outspoken and answer, but the rest of them just really, like you can just feel their body language where they're just like shutting in. It's very strange.
even for easy questions.
Even for easy questions.
Okay.
I mean, some of them are like, you run around the building, what does your heart rate do? Like I can ask a 3-year-old that question.
Yeah,
Everybody's gonna, it's gonna go up, and they're just like, no. It's really wild.
interesting, okay.
Yeah, so maybe it's just a particularly difficult group I have.
Well, no, I think the students, I know there were computer science students that I have them create a project that doesn't exist, and they were pitching apps related to emotional health. So they wanted to have an online place to go on their phone or computer to access help for feeling isolated and
Right.
lonely and depressed. and
Yeah,
anxious, and
Yes.
I thought, wow. Nobody my age would ever admitted to any of that stuff.
valid.
Yeah, it's just really, it's real.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
Do you think that forcing students into having to speak and participate though is sort of an antidote for the insular kind of isolation that is the iPhone and the computer and whatever came out of COVID?
I mean, I feel it would help get them out of their phones and have interpersonal contact, which is why they're so depressed, is because they're not, well, they have, you know, intimate conversations with like the desktop, but not with a person, right?
Yeah,
But when you get these DOS letters, when you're like specifically prohibited from doing that because it's too stressful, I don't know, it's just a weird world to me right now, but
So,
go ahead.
I just observed a colleague who was teaching a first semester language class. And I noticed that, you know, she cold called, it was a very comfortable class. I mean, it's small, now
Yes.
these are, you know, 16 students, right?
Right.
So they're small
Yeah.
classes.
yeah,
The nice thing about language with cold calling is that, you know, you don't have to worry about your ideology or anything,
Right.
especially a first semester language class, it's
Right.
like, did you study and do you know how to?
What does this
Right.
word mean?
And everybody is making mistakes.
Yeah.
So, but I noticed that that she called on everybody except a couple of students. And so I asked her, like, was that intentional? And it was. And these
Yeah.
were students that she
Yeah.
knew were suffering from anxiety.
Right.
She had spoken with them outside of class and they had kind of come to an agreement. So it didn't stop her from cold calling in
Right.
general, but
Yeah.
and with one of them, she said, well, some days he comes in and I know I have to call on him and other days I know that I shouldn't.
Right.
And that one, I never call on her or I prepare her ahead of time if I'm going to call on her.
yeah.
But she had just
Yeah.
kind of, and I was really kind of
Hmm.
interested to hear that, cause I
Yeah.
thought maybe they were sitting in the back, they came in late, she forgot to call on them.
No,
It
it's
was totally intentional.
And I gotta tell you, it's exhausting, like trying to keep up with what's on the PowerPoint slides and all that, like, I can't keep track of it, so it's just easier for me.
And with a bigger class, I think it is. And the other thing was, I like the idea of kind of the warm up, this scaffolding.
Yeah,
But also that I feel like there's always a tension between wanting to cram in all of the content
Yeah,
and doing this kind of
interactive.
scaffolding to make the class time more productive.
sure,
So that's, I mean, maybe another workshop.
Yeah.
Yeah,
yeah,
I mean, there are strategies, right? Like, so if you think about a particular class that you want to maximize interaction, maybe it is one class period or one subject matter that you want to do a flip model of instruction, or you do record the lecture and ask them to watch it ahead of time. And
Great
in
idea.
class, you don't have to do it for every single period of class, but you should be able to identify some of the sessions that would make more sense based on the subject matter and the learning objectives that you're trying to achieve.
yeah.
So something to consider. But I think some of these are wonderful techniques.
There was a question.
Also, Gretchen said she had a question and Tanya's got her hand raised.
Yeah, my question is.
Let's go with Gretchen. Gretchen first. Do you wanna unmute yourself, Gretchen?
Oh, I thought I did. Sorry.
Let me see. Let me get you. We can't hear you right now, but we'll try to maybe.
I can hear you.
Yeah, I'm unmuted.
Okay, oh, there it was on your end.
So I teach an engineering communications class and I have engineers of all disciplines. Okay. So I have the CS, I have the ORM, I have the ME, I have all of that. My question is, if we're preparing them for the future, for a real job to go out there and actually do a job, are we going to prepare them for the fact that, okay, nobody's going to call on you unless they know you're prepared? Or do we prepare them for the fact that people are going to ask them questions out of the blue and they need to be able to answer?
Agreed, but they're just so fragile.
I know, I think there is an argument to be made, right? Whenever you do start a class and you put in your syllabus that is part of one of the things that you want to do, like that ability to be able to answer, the ability to be able to feel comfortable answering questions when you're put on the spot.
Exactly.
And maybe it is part of the scaffolding that if you want in the beginning, you can give the questions ahead of time, but the expectation is they need to prepare, and later on in the semester, you're not gonna have that heads up anymore, right?
Right.
But the clickers, the technology at the bottom of the list comes in for also including those students. So if you provide other methods for them to engage, you know, technology can be bridging that gap where they can participate, they can send their answers, they don't have to raise their hand or be called on to participate. So it's just providing multiple ways to.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, I agree with Gretchen wholeheartedly, like mine are pre-meds, like you don't think a patient is gonna challenge you, they've already Googled all their symptoms. It's like.
Yeah. And I mean,
mean.
I'm in a professional school as well, so I have maybe the benefit of being able to say, your whole job as lawyers is to have to communicate. People are going to ask you questions. So this is preparation for what your career is going to be. Maybe it's a little different in undergrad, but you have a clear career path. Your engineering students have a pretty clear
Well, I
career
tell
path.
them if they want to get into management, they're gonna have to communicate.
Oh,
Because
yeah.
if you don't,
Yeah.
you can succeed in the design route, but that's a different pathway. But if you wanna go the other way, you've gotta get comfortable. I mean, I'm a retired public official, so I've been raked over the coals many times in public meetings, so you have to be thick-skinned and
Right.
and it's hard, and that's what distinguishes you. I tell my students the first day in class that everybody that with an engineering degree is considered technically, you have to be technically competent. Now, if you want to succeed, you have to get all of these soft skills and be able to communicate. So I have an icebreaker on day one. I take 5 minutes and I say, okay, turn to the person next to you and get to know them and interview them, because you're gonna introduce them in front of the class today. And
Good one.
they're like,
Yeah.
Good
and
one.
not just stand up, introduce yourself, you talk to somebody you don't know and
Yeah.
introduce them, and
Right.
here are the
I was
questions you
feeling that.
ask, and then they always really, they relax.
Yeah.
And they have to, they're, oh, this is kind of fun,
Yeah,
and then they have to get up in front of, I videotape every one of their presentations.
Yes.
So they are on camera and they get to see what they look like when they're out there, and that's really pretty eye-opening.
yeah, I think that's great as well. Yeah.
Tanya
Tanya's
raised
got a
her
question.
hand.
Oh, I was just going to say that one thing I try to explain to students, and I teach the first year students, typically medium-sized classes up to 80, but I do try to let them understand that when I call them by name, I'm trying to remember their names to put the face to the name. B, I'm calling them for different reasons. And on occasion, I call them because I see them hold on to their phones and it's time for them to realize that they're just distracting themselves, and they would benefit if they paid attention. So it's that kind of calling them. Other times I call them I truly want to know if they're paying attention or not, like if this is making sense. But the one thing I do emphasize is that don't take it personally, because me using your name is not an attempt to make you feel bad or anything like that. That my questions are just legitimately to try to help you, that if I say something, it's okay to be wrong. I don't expect you to give me the correct answer every time. And that there is a lot of benefit, even when you don't give me the correct answer, because it gives me a direction on when to go and how to maybe address that again in a different way. Or, there's things to be learned. So I try to kind of soften the blow if I call on somebody and they're like, oh, don't call on me. And I said, okay, maybe somebody else can help out. And then usually every class has those students that will speak up, that understand it, and they're not shy. And of course, those students that are, please don't call on me, don't pick on me, I don't know, and I just want to disappear, that kind of behavior. But one thing I did find interestingly is that the 8 a.m. class, hardly anybody participates. I can call on everybody and they look at me like, I said, are you okay? When I go to the 12:30 class, it's more like, okay, one at a time. Let me hear everybody, but one at a time. There is such a different personality in the two different times that the class is held that it's amazing. I don't know if the different personalities sign up for different times of the day or what it is, but anyway, that was just my my approach to it. Make them understand that don't feel like I'm putting you on the spot. Feel like I'm trying to help you and help me to understand where we're at.
I think the 8 a.m. could be a physiological also. It's like, I didn't know that. I normally am not super chatty in the morning because I'm still like getting my body to go,
Yeah,
Or
the people who are too late in the day, everyone's tired, yeah.
So I have another question. So I have team projects and they all go up on each talk. And again, I haven't been in the classroom in 13 years. But I have students who are so uncomfortable, they're just reading off whatever they put on their cell phone. Is that really what students are doing now? That they just don't even feel comfortable enough to talk about what's on a PowerPoint, that they actually have to have it spelled out and they're just looking down at their cell phone reading it? I just was aghast because I'd never seen that before, but again, maybe this has become more normal now. That we
is
have
it
cell
notes?
phones.
It's like they're taking notes and then.
They're not taking notes, they have a script.
They're reading the
They're
script.
reading their PowerPoint, they're just reading off their script while their PowerPoint slide is up, so they're giving a presentation. And they're reading, that's how uncomfortable they are.
Yeah.
Disallow
With a
that.
presentation, I just didn't even expect it, right?
Yeah.
The first time it happened, it's like, what did just happen here? So, and I haven't said anything, because I haven't had a clue as to whether that's normal now or not.
I don't think it's a normal thing.
I think it's something that people do.
Yes,
But it's not. normal.
yeah, people do in general, but I think it's harder because if you don't have that oral communication tag, for instance, in your course, that might not be a direct thing that you're trying to assess. But I think it is something that could be important, if you see it, you could address it, and maybe.
And
if
we're
you
not
do
talking
have
about
a-
first years, right? I'm talking about seniors.
Yeah, I have a question. Do you set expectations about what the presentation should be?
Yeah, I kind of
Yeah.
talked a bit about it, but I never thought that someone would type it into their cell phone and just read it off. I mean, that never even occurred to me that I might have to address that.
Yeah,
And I actually, so I have that in my rubric, right? But
Ah.
one of the
Interesting.
one set of points goes towards the presentational style, including not reading the whole presentation, et cetera.
Because some of them will turn and read it off the slide, right? I'm
Yeah.
not talking about that. That's just a form of reading.
Yeah.
I count off for that in my class.
Yeah, I do too, right? Don't want to look at the slide.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a different skill altogether. The skill of presentation
Yes.
is like an entirely different set of skills that you develop. But I think I learned my lesson from last year. I had students give presentation, end of year presentations on the paper they wrote. And half of them did really dynamic, interesting presentations. It's their own research, so that you should know what they're talking about. And then half of them sort of just like read from some kind of script or like read from their PowerPoint slides verbatim. And so this year when I assigned the presentation, I said, this is what I'm expecting the presentation to be like. So for instance, watch a few TED Talks. How do they all start out? With some kind of hook or story. I want you to start so I'm basically telling them what I want it to be like.
Yeah.
And none of it has to do with reading a script.
Right.
So, and again, maybe I don't know what kind of skills or like training they've had in giving presentations. So I'm sort of just like telling them what I want to hear. And with the expectation that like you will give a more dynamic, more interesting presentation, like you're here to communicate your ideas. People aren't gonna pay attention to you if you've got a bunch of stuff on the screen, you're just reading off the screen. Like you are here in your own capacity to like tell us something. And so I sort of have to like spell out in advance what I'm expecting, because I think there's a diversity of what people are comfortable with that they will.
Yeah, I tell my students like, who's your best professor that you've had,
Yeah,
and use whatever they do. And it's always like pictures, not words,
Yes,
right? You know,
exactly.
they all go to that same thing.
yes,
Yeah, so specs grading.
Yeah.
Specification is where you really like, this is what I expect from you, and it helps them, because I also couch it in, I wanna make you better, right? Communicate with other
Yeah.
people or whatever. So this is how you do a great job.
yeah,
So,
which goes to framing and
Right,
expectations.
framing.
And remember that the students that we'll see are always gonna be changing. So
Yeah.
it might be the start of a new era of, phone script reading.
yeah.
So as you see that, it's like, address it, now you're aware that it could be a possibility.
Yeah.
So it, set more of the expectation or show some examples of what you would believe it's like a good presentation. It's like, this is the type of stuff that I'm looking for, like you mentioned.
Yeah. I also, again, I'm so anti-technology in the classroom because I find it so distracting in daily life. And so it's even more distracting when you're trying to keep people engaged and they are, anything that pulls them in a different direction makes it harder. And even using an iPhone to read a script, or people are giving like bachelorette speech, or not bachelorette, wedding speeches and stuff, like reading their vows off of their phone. And I'm like, this is just so weird. Like, I don't like incentivize that at this point. So, like, you can bring in notes, of course, like that's fine. Everybody needs I typically have notes here when I'm doing this, but I always have notes in the room to show that I'm prepared, right? That I have like, this is my class plan. It's not for me to just like read off of my notes. So I try to, again, like model what I want to see from them as well. But
Sometimes, like you said, you have to frame it and say, I'm doing this on purpose.
yeah, exactly.
So
It's
you
not
do
just
this
like a
on-
random choice or
Right.
like a random thing I'm doing.
Yeah.
It's all of it's
a
intentional.
tool,
And I think they
yeah.
respond to, it's intentional. It's for you, not for me,
Mhm.
or
Right.
however you wanna put it. But I do think the like reading off the script off the phone is, it's either they're not prepared or they don't feel comfortable with material.
Well, I think it's the latter. They
Yeah.
don't feel comfortable with the material.
Yeah, and so they just haven't had enough time to prepare, and that's like every student waits
And then-
until the night before to do that artwork.
There are techniques to address that,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah,
So,
Yeah. I don't know if there's anything else in the conversation.
Let's see. No, it's just that we were talking about the different sections, like big difference between 2 and 3:30
Oh,
PM
yeah.
sections, and then Tanya was like, yeah, the students at 3:30 PM are probably there physically, but not mentally.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
lunchtime.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah, the 11 AM class is great.
Yeah.
And I teach at 11, and I don't know, it's my group this semester.
Yeah,
But it's
I
so
mean,
bimodal. See, I think that's the other thing that we're all kind of saying is it's so bimodal. Like you have the really great students who are always present and interacting.
yeah,
And then you have those that are always gonna have their head down and not gonna interact. And
Yeah.
that makes it all difficult, right? Because you're trying to spread it out more.
But one of the things that Hannah mentioned that is really important is if you build it into your assessment strategy,
Yeah.
that it is an expectation. And so, of course, they need to be intrinsically motivated to learn and participate and engage because they're making the most out of their experience. But realistically, it's not like that, right?
Right.
So you have to have that external thing.
Mhm.
Maybe it is the grade, it is that participation. It's like, you are gonna be expected to be prepared because we're gonna be discussing, you will be called, I might give you a little bit of heads up at the start of the semester, so you feel comfortable, but at the end of the semester, your expectations that you're gonna come prepared and I'll be able to call you. There's no punishment if you get it wrong. We just want you to get it there and get it talking.
Say something.
So like, we can put that in the syllabus, and make it inclusive by saying if you don't know that, you have a couple of passes that day, you'll ask a question, you just. I'm not feeling so confident, you can pass it up to 2 times in a semester, but then afterwards you need to be prepared, so they have to prepare more, knowing that they use all their passes, you know, but it is an inclusive teaching technique to give them the pass.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
And again, like, maybe there are like, tell me the facts of this case. If they haven't read the case, they won't know.
Right.
But what's your opinion about this concept, right? Anybody could answer that, even not having read the case. So, I have noticed that like, I'll call on students who like tend to be more shy or like haven't participated very much. I'll try and use my like, what's your opinion questions to call on them. Again, just as a way to like, kind of like grease the wheels of participation a little bit. And maybe they are just like never gonna be high participators. But I still think it's important, again, to the diversity of viewpoints. Somebody told me this in grad school and she was like, I'm calling on all of you because everyone has, and she made a really like, she was emphatic about like, everyone has a valid view that they're bringing to the room. I want to hear all of your voices. If I don't hear one of them, it's a disservice to the rest of us. And I think her framing of why she wants to call on all of us and that we have valid things to say and important viewpoints to bring, that really like clicked in my mind that like, yes, I have a contribution and I should share it. And she wasn't afraid to like call on each of us and say, you know, like, what do you think about this? And I'm gonna give you 3 minutes and we're just gonna pause, we're gonna think about it. And it was this uncomfortable silence, but I knew that I had some time to think. And it was very effective. And I mean, I loved this teacher and I loved the classroom experience as a result of that framing that she gave early on.
So see, first year students come in all varieties, and the range of abilities broader than ever, from the brilliance to the how we're ready to college.
Yes.
So true.
Yeah, and recognizing that people are coming from very different backgrounds, so.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for this conversation. It's
Yes,
really
that was
wonderful.
I always pick up a few nuggets.
Yeah.
So helpful.
And for me as well, like, to be reminded that, you know, like, some students are just like the fear and anxiety. It doesn't seem so bad this year.
It's
But maybe last year it was harder to like pull them out of their shells. But
Yeah.
maybe it's just like, as COVID gets further and further away,
That's the
we'll,
hope.
yeah.
Yeah, that's the hope.
It'll get easier.
I don't know, it's